afraid to even tell them, because this is so serious. You think Nebuchadnezzar were taking it seriously, but another year went by, and then King Nebuchadnezzar had not changed. And he's bragging about all the things that he's done, and how it was all by his own doing, and how great he is, and things of that sort. It's not a good picture. Something scary. And that makes us think even today, we get worried about people publicly showing pride to the world, especially in excess, and even more so, the pride is on things that are forbidden by God. And I just thought that was coincidental here with our studying material here. And there's lots of pride lessons in here, and the world is labeled June, or at least in the United States, I guess, is labeled June as Pride Month. There are all kinds of celebrations in Salt Lake City about taking pride in things that are basically rebellion to God. You just wonder, how long is that going to be allowed to happen? What's in God's mind as far as what He might do? Then more at our personal level, we need to think about who we give credit for successes in our lives. Do we give credit to God? Who gives us what we possess? And does God discipline us to help us see what is right? We're studying the book of Hebrews on Wednesday night, and I'll do in that class. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6 of Hebrews chapter 12 says, "And you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives." So we should welcome discipline from God, and we need to be corrected and shown the better way that God has provided for us. We just dream about the tree that Nebuchadnezzar had and remind us of also the kingdom of heaven being represented by a tree. Of course, we've been studying in Daniel about things that are going to happen in history and all empires that would come and go, but the kingdom of heaven always is there and way overtakes any of the others. So like in Mark chapter 4, verses 30 to 32, it says, in Mark 4, starting verse 30, "And he said, How shall we picture the kingdom of God? Or by what parable shall we present it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the soil, though it is smaller than all the seeds that are upon the soil, yet it is sown and grows up and becomes larger than all the garden plants and forms large branches so that the birds of the air can nest under its shade." Of course, you know that the kingdom of God is especially after everything was revealed there back in the first century, with Jesus coming to the earth and teaching us that he's the one that's reigning right now in his kingdom. And that kingdom is spread throughout the world. And that's where our trust should really be. And so that kind of finishes up chapter 4. So now we're going to go into chapter 5. And in this chapter, the period of time has passed. That Nebuchadnezzar was in probably for another 23 years or so after the things that happened at the end of chapter 4. place, so they're not mentioned here at this point in the book of Daniel, but in other places in the Bible we get some hints of this. We have a guy named Evil Narragaud. I don't know if the evil has anything, it's just treated as a name. But he reigned from 562 to 560 BC. He's Nebuchadnezzar's son. So Nebuchadnezzar's son ruled in his place originally, but not for very long. And so then another guy named Neriglissar, and I think there's different pronunciations and different spellings for that one, but from 560 to 556 BC, he took over for 4 years, and then handed it to the son of his, I guess, Labishi Marduk. And then he didn't even last for a year and was removed or killed by a guy named Nabonidus. And then Nabonidus had a son, Belshazzar, and that's the person we're going to start out with here in this point in history. But as far as Belshazzar, for years people thought that was just a made-up name and did not have any idea who that was, because that name didn't appear in historical sources that people often consulted to try to figure out who reigned when. But then eventually some more archaeological finds were found, and they found some cylinders. I'm not exactly sure what those are, but they have writings on them, and it talked about the reign of Nabonidus, and also talked about Belshazzar. And so the understanding now is that they basically co-reigned, so father and son. So the father went off and did other things, and Belshazzar was the one that was actually doing the work in the kingdom. But Nabonidus was not a popular king, so it's likely that maybe he got removed some of the historical writings back, and that's why it was hard to find that he even existed as ruler. Okay, so that kind of answers questions that people might bring up trying to discredit the book of Daniel, saying that it's not covering true history, but it really is, and it's actually a better source for history than most of the other things that we have, the Bible itself. And so it never gets proven wrong in that sense. So, Belshazzar, starting in chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, I'd like to read. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Of course, you can see that the true one and only true God is left out of this picture. And guess what? Even though Nebuchadnezzar learned a lesson, apparently it didn't pass down to the lineage, and didn't also pass down to others that took power later on. And so Belshazzar seems to have the same pride problem. Mm-hmm. And things don't, the red flags are going up as we think about that.
So you probably, it's just a supposition, but, saying that Nebuchadnezzar's experience didn't get passed down. His family probably just thought he went crazy. You know what I mean? And so they blew it off to that instead of,
But they didn't read what
Exactly, yeah, they just went on what they thought.
Or it's
Not what
likely
they-
that a lot of this stuff, this part, since chapter 4 was written from Nebuchadnezzar's viewpoint, it's likely that he might have written that down and then Daniel included that in his book. Anyway, there's a lot of things that are in the book of Daniel appear to be probably official documents at one time that got brought in because they talk about God being in control of his power. And the lessons that we're learning.
And I think it's interesting to key in on is that what he's about to go through, it said there in verse 1 that he made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine. And I think therein where is beginning the problem.
Yep.
He was drinking wine to excess, I'm sure. And so, excessive alcohol.
Yep. And you wonder, intoxicating beverages, you're really stepping on shaky ground if you partake at all, because people lose control.
Yep, makes bad
They
things.
don't say that they don't, but it appears that there's a lot of scientific evidence indicating that even a little causes you to do things that you may not normally, and your ability to do things like you should aren't there. So when people decide they're going to include intoxicating beverages in their diet in any form, it appears that you could say that God's given us several warnings throughout his book, and here's a lesson right here. You know what can happen when you take on these things. And so if you're partaking, you may be considered in rebellion to God, because you're not wanting to accept that lesson. And we're trying, how close can we get to crossing the line? Or we do things that are not according to the will of God. And that seems to be the issue with pride. It starts out small, and next thing you know, you got God completely out of the picture. So he has all these people, this huge feast. This is being very, very public celebration, showing off what he has, and he decides to bring out these vessels that came from the temple, and that, of course, was noted. We saw in the history when we read the book of Ezra, that eventually those things were actually returned to Jerusalem later on after the captivity. But Nebuchadnezzar seemed to keep them put away, didn't go as far as this Belshazzar is. Because that's like open rebellion. We're going to take these sacred, holy vessels, if you can call it that they were using in temple services in the past, and we're going to use them for this big wild party that we're having to show off to everybody. Of course, you use intoxicating alcoholic drinks in them to make everyone, I guess, release their inhibitions. They've not done things, but now they go ahead and do it. So mocking God, praising all these other gods, idols, not honoring God in any way. And maybe a lesson today is that we have to be careful even in our worship services. Do we turn it into a big show, party, entertainment? That God isn't really commanded in any way, and is not said that those things please him, even though they may be pleasing to us, and seeing good music and the entertainment aspect and all that. but God doesn't command that. So we start incorporating things that God hasn't commanded into our worship, and it becomes more of a show our pride in our congregation or whatever, to get people to come. That's not seeming to be a good thing. And so we have this phrase that's used often in our, I hear it a lot. Probably more than once just in the last week. The phrase handwriting on the wall. You see handwriting on the wall. You wonder how many people even remember or know where that came from. And what does it mean? Why do people use that phrase? What does it mean to them? When you hear that phrase from somebody, what are they saying? As far as what they think.
Like an example of finality.
Now there's going to be an
Or-
end to
Yeah.
whatever is happening right now.
Or it's about to happen.
Yeah,
Usually when you say the handwriting's on the wall, then it's something that you know,
There's going to be a major change.
something major change is going to happen.
And so it's used on lots of TV shows and movies and things like that too. So, verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. And all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew paler, and his nobles were perplexed. So just like Nebuchadnezzar did in several occasions in the past, they try to bring up all these special people that apparently are being paid for by the government, as you say, to give answers to things, and they don't know. They can't answer what's going on here. So there's lots of fear expressed. This is a very unusual event. There's panic. And you say that now the king's somewhat humiliated in all that arrogance that he's just expressed. No one can read this, what it says. They don't know what it says. The wise men cannot interpret it. Don't even think about consulting a man of God or including God in the picture here as far as answering these things. And it's, I guess you could say, common that there's rebellion in young kids sometimes, and teenagers especially, and they don't want to follow the lessons learned from parents or grandparents. They have to learn it themselves, I guess. That could be too late. It appears to be the case with Belshazzar. What do you think?
Sounds like he sobered up pretty fast.
And when he says make the person third in the kingdom, that's somewhat understood as because Nabonidus and Belshazzar were probably doing this leading together. So Belshazzar is actually second, 23. So someone else enters the picture. The queen entered the banquet hall, verse 10 here. Because of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Oh yeah, there's this guy Daniel. He was did well in the past as far as answering these things. And of course, people will attack some of the phrases here because it's calling him his father, but we know that in a lot of cases that can include grandfather, relatives before that. And so that's not really, you could say, a contradiction to history. That's just how terminology gets brought out. But King Nebuchadnezzar, he consulted Daniel first, last. I guess quite a few years have gone since the last event that was recorded here, and who knows if they had access to anything else that might have happened in their history since then. Okay, so there is a person who knows, and has the ability. After we see, do we forget when everything seems to be going well? Do we forget God's picture, His place in our lives, His providence? Daniel's probably, we think probably in the 60s or so at this point in his life, so he's getting elderly. He been put aside, and of course we had all these different rulers coming in and out like that I just mentioned, and so Daniel kind of got lost in the shuffle, you could say, as far as all these things happening. Okay, so I guess it's up to verse 13. And Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare an interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, and you are able to give interpretations to solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make the interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." So now the king talks about things that he might have heard about Daniel. And he realizes he's going to need Daniel's help, of course, ultimately God. In verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Keep your gifts for yourself, or give the rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he has bestowed on him, all the would tremble before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was disposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew of the heaven, until he recognized the Most High God as ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But God, the God in whose hand are your life breath, and all your ways you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Daniel's saying the real source of these things is from God. And that's the one that this king should be listening to and honoring. Because he's not been doing that. And so he gives a quick recap of the history of Nebuchadnezzar and what his last lesson was. And that Belshazzar is not recognizing God, even though he knew it.
See, right there it says he knew. He just chose to ignore.
How many people in this world know that God exists? These have heard about him, I guess we'll say, if they don't believe it. And so what nerve does Belshazzar have in using these holy vessels for unholy purposes? Well, that's, we think it's just a physical and not an important thing in a way, but what it's representing is what is the issue, the rebellion against God. And he apparently knew what he was doing. And so God was not being glorified. We need to keep the lesson in our minds that we don't take God's glory away in our daily actions, and what we do in front of people. And so this pride issue just keeps coming up. Okay, so what do you see in this writing on the wall? Verse 25. Now this is an inscription that was written out many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Many, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And so this word, many, it's like similar to like we heard the mina being 50 shekels, a measure of something that is numbered. And so it looks like Belshazzar's days are numbered. In fact, they're very, very short. He's coming really close to the end, isn't it? I guess, I think you could say that there's a phrase called, his number is up. Probably comes from here. So, tekel, the weighing on the scales, might be similar like the word shekel, when we count the money. Peres, the kingdom is to be divided. The word upharsin represents half shekels. And so Peres is like a singular form of that word. And so this, not only is this kingdom going to come to an end, but it's going to actually go to two directions at the same time. We've been reading, with other visions that Nebuchadnezzar had in history, that, the Medes and Persians seem to kind of come in at a similar time and basically became one force that got rid of Babylon. Okay, so it gives us an idea of what was being said there. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. And verse 30, that same night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. So there's the end of his rule. That very night, there wasn't any chance for, you could say, if he would ever repent from what he just did. And verse 31 says, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age of 62. And you could say that part really kind of goes into the next chapter, because it's talking about a later time. There's a mixture of people being in rule, as we have with both the Medes and the Persians. And eventually, as Darius comes, the one out in front. So what do you think? Lots of lessons from this?
He didn't have much time like Herod, one of the Herods that said the voice of God and not of a man. Got worms and died. And that was pretty quick too.
God determines what's going to happen. He knows people's hearts, whether other actions would be worthwhile or not, and what would be the outcome. It's way over our heads to understand all of that, but we need to keep our trust in Him. But He's definitely working in our best interest, doing what's best for us, giving us the opportunities that we each need. They may be different for every person. Well, we still got a few minutes left. I guess we can go ahead and start in chapter 6.
So I take it since Belshazzar was killed and his dad was not present, I mean, Daniel ruled the kingdom, right? He was third in line.
That's what I said. It looks like there's probably a period of time here.
Yeah, no.
When we go to verse 31, so.
But in the interim.
I guess say instantaneous change in power. But Belshazzar is out of the picture.
Yeah, I'm sure all that the kingly line stuff, that who he appoints as to be a leader, that all gets kind of swept under the carpet once he's gone. So,
And the interesting thing is when you look at people trying to map out who's in power and all these kingdoms and stuff, and one of the things that seems to be common in all of these is that there's a lot of rulers that have the same name. That is add other part, piece of description or number or whatever, and they kind of switch back and forth between names. So I think that makes it kind of confusing trying to actually track everything for sure of what's going on. It's also detract from the lessons that we can learn from these events that are recorded for us. So chapter 6, verse 1, it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. I think we talked about before these different levels of leadership, and the satraps are fairly high in the running, and they take regions in these kingdoms. Verse 2 again, over them 3 commissioners, whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. And Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. And the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. And these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him in regard to the law of his God. Sounds like politics today. They're gonna dig up something. They don't want this Daniel to basically displace them.
Imagine mudslinging.
I think we'll go ahead and
Even in
stop
Bible
there.
times.
Show us more of that next week. The kingdoms come and go. Well, we know that God's kingdom is Jesus currently sitting at his right hand.